Hello and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to talk about sending ServiceNow events to Power Automate. Let's go. For those that follow me closely, probably know that I am a big fan of ServiceNow. I've used it in the past at a previous company, and I think it's a good, solid platform, solid solution, has a lot of extensibility points, and is generally best in class when it comes to service management in the enterprise. One thing, though, that is a bit challenging is getting data out of it. It's very easy to put data into it, and you can certainly do that using like out-of-box connectors that we do find in Power Automate and Logic Apps as well. But one thing that is missing is a trigger. And I'm not exactly sure why there's no trigger. I have a suspicion that it's more around just the model that ServiceNow has introduced, because if you look at other platforms, they don't have triggers either. And I think the reason for that is that ServiceNow has a capability called business rules. And business rules become the preferred way of actually extracting data from ServiceNow and pushing it to another system. So naturally, with the existing action and connector that we do have, we can go query. But we do know that querying isn't the most effective or efficient way of accessing data. Depending upon your licensing model, it can also have implications as well. So you may not want to pull every 5 minutes because that could either use up runs if you are on a license inside of Power Automate where you have so many runs per month. And if you're on the Logic App side, in general, outside of ICE, you are going to pay per transaction. So you're basically paying to see if there's any data. And so what business rules allow us to do is to actually, when a specific event occurs, go ahead and call an endpoint. And the endpoint really gets defined as part of this outbound REST message facility that they have. It's a pretty cool little tool. And then you can use that to generate a script that you can then include in your business event. Once you're in the business event, you can actually filter out events. Was the status of this, say, incident moved from new to pending? Is it assigned to a specific group? And that's what we're going to see today. Then go ahead and kick off that process. So that's what the essence of this video is about. I haven't seen a lot of content like this, so I'm really hoping this is valuable. Also, do note that I have created a playlist inside of my channel for topics specifically related to ServiceNow. So go ahead and check that out if you haven't done so already. Before we dive deeper into the content, I wanted to let you know about an emerging community found at serverlessnotes.com. This is a community resource that covers best practices, tips, and latest announcements built on contributions by technology enthusiasts from around the globe. On serverlessnotes.com, you'll find content related to Power Automate, Azure Logic Apps, Azure Service Bus, Azure Functions, and much, much more. Serverlessnotes.com is brought to you by Serverless 360, a portal that is focused on operations and support for Microsoft Azure serverless resources. Now, this is a complementary tool to the Azure portal, and it helps organizations in supporting Azure serverless applications. You can find out more about Serverless 360 at serverless360.com. So this is what our solution looks like, and I'm going to really focus on the outbound portion of ServiceNow. Naturally, we need to create a record in order for the outbound portion to fire. And I'm not going to go through that in a whole lot of details. But the scenario is just around customer service. And we've got someone that's working with customer service in a bot, a conversational bot, that's going to go ahead and create a record related to their account. And what will happen is when this ticket gets logged and it gets logged to a risk management group, we were then going to have a business rule that is looking for those types of events. So incident created, assignment group starts with risk management. When that happens, go fire off and talk to an endpoint. And that endpoint is going to be hosted in Power Automate. And we're going to expose that just through the HTTP trigger. And we will go ahead and construct a message body, a message shape that we're expecting to be passed in. And then on the ServiceNow side, what we'll do is we'll build the message to align to that. Then what we're going to do is just go ahead and perform some logic. It's rather arbitrary, but we're going to then go ahead and push an event or a message over to Microsoft Teams and the risk management group so that they're aware that this ticket has been logged and that they should now go ahead and respond to it. Now I'm going to walk through the next couple slides right in the tool itself, but I just wanted to introduce the concepts. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to go ahead to the Outbound REST message tool that exists inside of ServiceNow. And what you can do is go ahead and search for REST and then find it Outbound REST message. And then you have the ability to go ahead and create this endpoint. And this is where we're going to configure our REST message to point to our Power Automate HTTP trigger. And at that point, we're going to then need to construct a message that aligns to what we've exposed in the trigger so that we don't have a mismatch when those messages are sent. We want those to line up correctly. So we'll go ahead and do that. We'll also talk a little bit about variables that help you to do dynamic injection of specific values as the message gets sent outbound. Now, a couple things we want to talk about is roles. So you do need one of these three roles in order to access this tool. You've got the Web Service Admin, the REST API Explorer, or Admin. For the purposes of what I'm showing you here, I am logged in as an admin just because I'm in a personal ServiceNow tenant, but do be aware of those roles that you need. And that's the outbound REST message piece. Now, what we need to do is, once that is defined, then we can go talk about our business rule. And we can then go ahead and define when we want our business rule to fire, and when that occurs, we'll then go ahead and call a script. And that's what you see in the bottom right-hand corner here. That is a script that we're going to call, and this was generated from the experience that we just talked about. The outbound REST message facility is going to give this for us. So we can go ahead, it'll then fire this script code whenever that event occurs and actually send that out over the wire to Power Automate. Now we're going to see this later on in the demo when we walk through the Power Automate flow. So I just wanted to call it out here now. Inside of ServiceNow, they've got different states for their incidents. And so this is the out of box. Now I think you can go ahead and override these and configure them to meet your needs. But as I was working through this example, this is at least my experience. It's kind of like enums, right? So if you receive a status of 1, that means the incident is new. If you receive a status of 2, it means it's in progress, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to call that out because we do have a bit of logic in the flow where I do a switch statement and trying to check, what is the value, and based upon that, I can indicate, oh, this is a new case, or this is a pending case, or this is on hold, that sort of thing. So just a heads up from that perspective. Okay, so we're going to jump right into the demo, and I'm going to start here in Power Automate just to explain the process of how we build this. Then I'll run it after, which I know is out of order from what I typically do, but I just think understanding these building blocks up front makes a lot of sense. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to expose an HTTP trigger. As part of that, I am defining the message shape that I'm expected to be passed in. Now this is going to be a post message that does come in, and I want to be able to capture items like the updated time, the number itself, which is basically like the case number, short description, the caller ID, which is basically an ID as it implies, of the person who's actually created the request, the assignment group, so who this is being assigned to, and the state. And so these are going to be values that are pushed from ServiceNow into this specific flow. From there, we're just going to acknowledge the fact that we've received it, and then I'm not going to go through this in a whole lot of detail, just managing that state, what we talked about before, determining the state. Is it a new record? Is it closed? Is it an updated? That sort of thing. Now, because we've got IDs being passed in, right, the assignment group, like that's going to be an ID, I want to go ahead and get the display name for that. So that's where I'm going to provide a query of sysid equals the assignment group. And because then I need to go ahead and fetch the details for that assignment group so that I can use its display name when I go ahead and push a message into Teams. I'm going to do something similar with the user. I want to know who the caller is, so I have to go up and call the user table and actually pass in a caller ID to get the full details about the person that logged the ticket. And so that's the same thing with group. You can see this record type, that means it's coming from the group table, and then this is coming from the user table. But the data that's actually being passed here is really from the incidents table. And so it's going to be just a raw push, and as a result you get IDs that refer back to the other entities. You don't get all of their display name. So that's what I'm really going to go ahead and do here. Then what I do is, because naturally with these list records, you always run into that situation where you would apply for each would actually be returned, like it's a list, even though I know we only have one record. So I'm just going to go ahead and use an expression that allows me to go ahead and just pull out the first record, because I don't want to be adding all these loop shapes. I'm doing the same thing with assignment group. You can still use apply to each if you want, but I'm not rolling that way, at least not today. Then what we'll do is just have a switch statement that's checking to see if it's new, if it's on hold, if it's resolved, if it's closed, that sort of thing. And then what we'll do is we'll just post a message to teams. And here's where we're going to include the assignment group. And now this is going to be like the display name, as opposed to like the ID that we would have received previously. We've got the ticket number when it was last updated. So this could be a create date or it could be an updated date. It's basically last modified. Think of it from that perspective. The short description of the incident itself, and then the current state. Is it new? Is it on hold? Is it closed? Is it resolved? That sort of thing. So this is our flow that we need to have built first. And then what we'll do is we can go ahead and flip over to ServiceNow. What I'm going to do is go to ServiceNow, and once again, I said I'm logged in as an admin, and we talked about the roles previously in the slides, but I can go ahead and find this experience by typing in REST and then looking for System Web Services Outbound REST message. And what I would be able to do is go ahead and click New here. I've already done that, but that's how we're going to establish one of these endpoints. So I've called mine call flow endpoint, and what I do have is some details I have to provide. Now, you're wondering, okay, well, how do I manage basically the URL? So this is, unfortunately, what you're going to have to do is copy this URL from our trigger and then paste it here. Now, what I realized is that the URL for our flow is too long. You can't actually include the whole thing here because it'll be too long. So it's more of a design time limitation than a runtime limitation. So how I worked around this was I went ahead and I created some variables that I can go ahead and inject at runtime. And I'll show you that here shortly, but I've got one called base URL, and that is basically sort of the core URL part of my message, or of my URL rather. And that basically it's like this part here where I've just basically pulled it out and I'm storing it as a variable so I can kind of trick ServiceNow, or at least work around this GUI limitation. Now what you can do, this is sort of like, think of it as like the holistic like endpoint, but naturally when you have endpoints you can have multiple operations. You can have your post or your get or your put or your delete, and that's where you can go ahead and model out additional calls. So that's where you see this HTTP methods here. I've got one here that's going to be called post, and I could go ahead and create multiple ones, but in this case I've created new, and I've got one called, I just called it default post, and now we can go further explore. So once again, it's going to pull in the endpoint by default. It'll pull that from the parent. We can go ahead and change this name if we want. We can indicate the different method. In this case, we want to have post. And these are the variables, and this is really important. It's actually a pretty cool feature. It's a substitution that you will do at runtime. And so what you can do is you start out by basically using this to test your endpoint. So before we even go configure a business rule itself, we're going to go ahead and test all of this. And what you want to do is you want to create all of these variables that will then get passed in as sample data to your endpoint call. And so this is where I've constructed that base URL, where I've taken the first part of the base URL, and then I've got sample data for assignment group, caller ID, number, short description, state, and updated on. Once we've gone ahead and populated all of that, we can go ahead and click on this test button. And what it'll do is it'll automatically fire an endpoint. It'll fire the endpoint, and this is actually the content that was sent, and this was all done at runtime. It went into our system variables, pulled out that sample data, stuffed it into the outbound message, and sent it across the wire. And what has happened is Flow has returned a HTTP status code of 200, which is what we want. Here, that's the purpose of this call here. Now, I guess in theory, this could have been a status code of 201, but it doesn't really matter in this case. This is the status code that was returned back. So let's just go ahead and just check on the run history. And sure enough, we can see 44 seconds ago, it did fire. And it fired because we used that test tool inside of ServiceNow. Now let's just back up one time here. I just want to show one other bit. And so that's where we've gone ahead and said test. And this will basically then use this data to execute that test. Now, this is pretty important. Preview script usage. And so this is what's going to happen is it's going to give us sample script that we can include in our business rule based upon all of the data that we've got configured as our variables. So here we can see all of the parameters. So sys updated on, right? It's going to provide this value. Well, this value is coming from this list here. And that goes on for all of our other parameters are all here. So what we can now do is copy this script and then actually use it in our business rule. So this is actually a handy little feature. There's some things we don't need which have been commented out, which we can go ahead and just delete. So that's our outbound messaging tool that ServiceNow creates. So this is where you're going to spend some time and make sure that you've got everything modeled and working. It's kind of like an API console that you'd find in an API management tool, but get this working first. There's no point even looking at business rules till you get this working. You know, you're going to be in between this screen and your flow tab where you're working through that flow design and going back and forth and iterating on that as required. Now, let's flip over. Let's now talk about business rules. So business rules, the easiest way to find them is just to type business rules, and then you're going to see system definition business rules. Go ahead and click on that. And here you're going to learn about how vast ServiceNow actually is. So these are all out-of-the-box business events that ServiceNow is using to run their own system. Like this is an out-of-box experience, and these are all of the business rules that they have provided. And what I have learned by going through all of this is that they typically use this as an extensibility feature for customers. So for example, you might want to hide a field that is on a form. You can do that using a business rule. You know, when a specific event fires, like launching a page, go ahead and hide different data elements. And I've seen them actually do that with some of their own stuff. And so it is interesting, but go ahead and learn more about business rules from that perspective. Now let's go ahead and find mine, because there are just pages of them, right? Like there's 2,378 of these, and I've created one. So that just goes to show you how many do exist. So I made it easy. I just prefixed it with my initials, and here we've got KW incident created. So I would have created it by clicking on new and then populating it with all of these different values. Now, what's going on here? So I'm going to go ahead and choose the table that I want this business rule to be attached to. And here I've gone ahead and have it set to incident. Great, that's perfect. Now, obviously I want it to be active, and I do want the advanced capabilities where I will go ahead and include that scripting. Now, what this event is going to listen to is it will listen to this table, and then it'll fire after any record has been inserted or created, or a record has been updated. We could go ahead and attach to these other events, but for now that's out of scope. That's not sort of key to our scenario, but you could do it. Then what we want to have happen is we only want this event to fire when we've got a new record or updated record in the incident table, and when the assignment group starts with risk management. Now I could go ahead and change this and say, is risk management, same thing. But that's essentially how I've modeled this. And then so what happens is whenever that does fire, we are then going to go ahead and fire this script. Now this was the script that I had copied from our outbound REST message, but there's a few tweaks that I did have to make. So one, I got rid of all of those commented codes that were out there. Then what I also did was I went ahead and I need to inject the actual value from the record in our incident table at runtime. Previously, it was always dealing with these parameters, and the parameters are fine when you're testing something, but here's where we're going to go ahead and inject them at runtime. So this is where I went ahead and said, okay, I need the updated on field, I needed the number field, I needed the short description field, and so on and so forth. Now, the other thing that's happened here is this is essentially going to model our outbound message shape. So I showed you that over here when we go ahead and we test. Like, this is the outbound message shape that's going to get passed over to Flow, and this is exactly what our trigger is expecting. So it's one of those things, you build out your trigger, you establish what that sample message shape looks like, then you almost need to like bring that over here and then model it in the same way. And that's exactly what's going on here with our business rule, is it's going to generate a message that has the same shape that our flow is expecting. So you do have to sort of work all of these bits in concert with each other, because if you have mismatches, you're going to actually have a failure. And so in the event that an exception is returned from our flow, we will display a message saying that this has failed. And so this is the essence of our business rule and how it gets attached and associated to specific table events that do occur, and then also the conditions that you can apply. You can add and or clauses here, so you can develop some fairly sophisticated business rules as required. Okay, great. So this is the background that's out of the way. Let's now go ahead, let's run this. And naturally, we need to go ahead and create a record. So I'm just going to do that through a chat bot. Once again, not going into a whole lot of details here, but this will create the record, and then it'll flow through and call our endpoint. And I will say it is rather immediate. You should only have to wait like a few seconds for your flow to get called. If you're waiting minutes, there's something else going on here. So this is just a customer service scenario, as I've talked about before. So now I need to provide my email address for my account. My account number. A fictitious date of birth, and a brief description. So what this is going to do in the background, it's going to go ahead and create a new incident inside of ServiceNow. And then our expectation is once that incident has been created, it's going to then go ahead and fire off and call our flow that's going to be responding to these particular events. So there we've got a ticket 48 that has been created. So let's just flip right over to our flow, and let's just take a look at our run history. So sure enough, 24 seconds ago, this flow was called. So that is pretty much immediate in terms of our flow being called after the business rule has fired, which is great news. Once again, back to that whole polling scenario where we would be checking for data like every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, hour. This is where we're actually seeing it in runtime, or in real time. So here we can go ahead and take a look at all of the data that's been passed in. We talked about that. The ticket number being 48. And then we're just going to go through different logic. We're going to look up our records, and we're going to be able to pull out the name, the full name of the person who went ahead and called that flow, and that's where we're just going to see it all here, right? We can see it was Weare, the account number, odd charges, and basically that's all being pulled out in these compose statements based upon our calls to ServiceNow to enrich our data. If we flip over to Teams, sure enough, we can see that we've got a new incident 48 that has been created. All right, so that concludes the demo for this week. I hope you enjoyed that. I know it's a lot of information that is in that content, so do ask any questions below, and happy to go ahead and follow up with you if you had specific questions about ServiceNow and Outbound integration with Power Automate. Once again, if you have not been following me on Twitter, I'd encourage you to do so. You can find me at Weare, and naturally you're on my YouTube channel, so I really appreciate you watching. Go ahead and like and subscribe if you're interested in more of this sort of content. So take care, and we'll see you again soon back on the channel. Later.